A claim often made by Muslim activists is that the Islamic world made a great contribution to philosophy and science. This contribution is often referred to as the golden age of Islamic science, and it is sometimes even claimed to have triggered the European Renaissance and even the European Enlightenment. This video will discuss the golden age of Islamic science, the role of people such as Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, their influence on European thinking, and the extent to which this influence is thanks to Islam or despite of Islam.
So you were only 1,322 years off. Not bad? Not bad start there. Talking of maths, by the way, a man named Al-Khwarizmi was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, a Muslim, worked in the golden age of Islam. He's the guy who came up with not just algebra, but algorithms. Without algorithms, you wouldn't have laptops. Without laptops, Daniel Johnson tonight wouldn't have been able to print out his speech in which he came to berate us Muslims for holding back the advance and intellectual achievements of the West, which all happened without any contribution from anyone else other than the Judeo-Christian people of Europe. In fact, Daniel David Levering, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and author of The Golden Crucible, points out that there would be no Renaissance, there would be no Reformation in Europe without the role played by Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and some of the great Muslim theologians, philosophers, scientists in bringing Greek texts to Europe.
Now this is the type of energetic rhetoric that comes across as very convincing and is often taken at face value by us Westerners. Younger people in Western Europe sometimes even embrace this type of rhetoric as an expression of moral virtue and as if it were some sign of allowing some oppressed group to finally emancipate itself. But is what Mehdi Hasan is saying here actually true? Let's dig into it. Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. This area was never included in any of the classical civilizations. If you look at the Persian Empire, for example, it ignored the Arabian Peninsula. The same is the case for the East Roman or Byzantine Empire and for the Egyptian Empire. It was not that these empires weren't able to include the Arabian Peninsula into their area of control, it was just that they weren't interested. There was nothing there, so to speak. Before Islam emerged out of the Arabian Peninsula, the regions of North Africa and much of the Middle East used to be part of the Christian world, where the Greek philosophical heritage was well known to the people. If you then look at Islam in the year 850, you can see that they basically conquered these geographical areas. Nowadays, when we think about Egypt, Syria or Central Asia, we view these areas as Islamic areas. But these areas really used to be areas of Greek heritage and Persian heritage. They used to be areas of great intellectual heritage and scientific work. When talking about Islam and science, the first thing that needs to be emphasized is that in Islam, the law of cause and effect is not recognized. This is a very important detail about Islam because scientific thinking is based on the idea of cause and effect. A people following an ideology that rejects cause and effect generally can't engage in science. In Islam there is no cause and effect because Allah can recreate the world any moment He desires and change the laws of nature. So there is no point in studying these, and doing so anyway is even considered by the stricter Muslims as an act of apostasy. When Islam conquered the classical world, they burned most of the literature that they found. For example, when Islam conquered Alexandria in the year 640, they destroyed everything that they could find. The work of this very interesting and distinctive civilization, manuscripts about math, astronomy and who knows what else, ended up being destroyed. This means that we today do not have access to most of the intellectual work of the Egyptians because Islam destroyed it. They did the same to other important centers of intellectual heritage. Who today has ever heard about the work of the Nestorian Christians or about the work of the Chaldean Christians? Later, when Islam conquered the Indian Peninsula, they did the same there as well. The largest library on the Indian subcontinent was the Library of Alanda. It got completely burned down. The Islamic modus operandi related to the literature here that they found was basically as follows. If it is something that is not written in the Quran, destroy it, because it means that it is not important. Because if it were important, it would have been written in the Quran. If it is something that can also be found in the Quran, destroy it, because we already have it anyway, because it's in the Quran. This way of reasoning basically means burn all the writings of non-Islamic cultures that you can get your hands on. Yet, activists like Mehdi Hasan often claim the following.
Crucible points out that there would be no Renaissance, there would be no Reformation in Europe without the role played by Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and some of the great Muslim theologians, philosophers, scientists in bringing Greek texts to Europe.
So let's discuss these Islamic philosophers that are mentioned by Mehdi Hasan and by people similar to him. The regions that Islam conquered were filled with some of the remains of the classical civilizations, and many of the peoples that were forced to convert to Islam were people who previously belonged to these classical civilizations. So of course within this large region there were people who were interested in studying their own classical civilizations. Generally speaking, they weren't really allowed to do so, but there were certain shorter time periods within certain smaller regions, often created by certain rulers in these regions, when there was a bit more tolerance towards those who wanted to study the classical works. Mehdi Hasan just mentioned Ibn Rushd. He was a man who was very interested in the Greek heritage and especially in Aristotle. Ibn Rushd lived in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, during a time when the local ruler was Abu Yaqub Yusuf, a Muslim ruler who also happened to be interested in Greek philosophy. Ibn Rushd wanted to open Islam up to rational criticism and make Islam more in accordance with the work of Aristotle. Now, to many Western today, this would immediately prove that Islam and science do get along. This isn't the case, however. To get an idea of the type of beliefs that Ibn Rushd had, here are some quotes from him. The world is divided in man with humor and no religion, and man with religion and no humor. And women must be treated as human beings and not as pets. These type of statements are not in accordance with Islam at all. So Ibn Rushd ended up being prosecuted, and most of the literature that he created ended up being burned. A small part of his work that didn't get burned ended up in the hands of European thinkers, who got to know Ibn Rushd as Averroes, which is basically a Latin version of his name, and who spoke about the man very positively. His work ended up in the hands of Jacob Anatoli, the French Jewish philosopher and translator. He translated Averroes' work from Arabic into Hebrew, which then ended up influencing Jewish philosophy through the work of Maimonides in the 12th century. In addition, Italian philosopher Thomas Aquinas ended up being influenced by the work of Aristotle, which became available to the people in Europe from the year 1140 onward through the translations that were made possible thanks to people like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. This caused the Europeans to wrongly associate the Greek heritage with the Islamic world, a misconception that wasn't corrected until much later. I just mentioned the name Ibn Sina. This is another philosopher that is often mentioned by Muslim activists. He was a child prodigy who was born in the year 980 in the area that we now know as Uzbekistan. During that time period, that area was a part of the Samanid dynasty, a Persian dynasty located in Central Asia. The Samanid dynasty lasted from 819 to 999 and was famous for maintaining their Persian intellectual heritage, despite them being conquered by Islam and being forced to live as Muslims. Ibn Sina had memorized the entire Quran by the age of 10, but not much later he started to learn Indian mathematics and became fascinated by a traveling scholar who was able to cure the sick. As a teenager he studied Aristotle, which he had access to thanks to the commentaries written by Al-Farabi, another Muslim translator of Aristotle's work. Ibn Sina's fascination with medicine motivated him to make a great contribution contribution to the area of medicine. His work ended up in Europe, where he became known as Avicenna. Because of his fascination with scientific thinking, he was a controversial figure in his own time period, as he was often referred to as a kafir by the more devout Muslims. But because of his medical talents, he was quite useful to have around for local rulers during their times of bad health. Mehdi Hasan also mentioned Al-Khwarizmi, who is often claimed to be the founder of algebra. Just like Ibn Sina, he too came from the Persian tradition and studied Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics. His work ended up in Europe, which basically led to the word algebra. Another person who is often mentioned by Muslim activists is Ibn Khaldun, a historian and sociologist who studied social cohesion and tribalism. He too was a fan of the Greek intellectual heritage, and his work on the rise and fall of civilization ended up in the hands of Ottoman historians, who used his theories to examine the progress and the failures of their own Ottoman Empire. Now, of course, intellectual work is always based on previous work of other people. For example, if we take Thomas Aquinas, we can say that the lines of influence could be as follows. Of course, this is ignoring other influences to Thomas Aquinas that are not Ibn Rushd. But based on something like this, Muslim activists like Mehdi Hasan like to call Ibn Rushd the father of the European Renaissance, or the father of the European Enlightenment even. This is extremely disproportionate, because no single person can be called the father of any of these time periods. The European Renaissance started from the Italian independent city-states, after scholars from the Byzantine Empire had to flee from the Turks and ended up in Italy, and none of these Byzantine scholars has ever been referred to as the father of anything. In addition, if we were to expand these lines of influence further, it would look as follows. So is Aristotle now the father of the Renaissance and of the Enlightenment? Let's expand this picture even further and further. The so-called Golden Age of Islamic science can better be described as a period when a handful of individuals were translating some of the Greek work into Arabic and were interested in studying Indian mathematics. It can better be described as the final breath of the classical civilizations after the Muslims destroyed it, or the sad aftermath of Greek, Persian and Indian science, or something like that. Calling it the Golden Age of anything is quite disrespectful towards those civilizations whose work got destroyed by Islam. In addition, this handful of individuals were doing what they were doing despite of Islam and not thanks to Islam, and were basically continuing other philosophical traditions than Islam. If you look, for example, at the number of Dutch thinkers during the Dutch Golden Age, you can already see a list of individuals that is much longer than this handful of Islamic individuals, and this is just the Netherlands, a piece of land less than half the size of Jordan. So let's not even begin to discuss the contributions of thinkers from Italy, France, England and Germany. In addition, there is another important difference between these individuals in the Islamic world and the thinkers in Europe. The thinkers in the Islamic world didn't end up influencing Islamic culture. If Islam wouldn't have been such a rigid ideology, people like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina could have been the Enlightenment thinkers of the Islamic world. However, they didn't, and their work has been forgotten by the Muslim world, just like the work of the Coptic and the Nestorian Christians. In Europe, the philosophers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment actually ended up influencing the European mind, which we today know as the Western mind. The influence from the church was pushed back as a result, and the Western people who today call themselves Christians can better be described as Greco-Roman Enlightenment followers, or something like that. It is just that it sounds kinda weird. It is important to realize that the Muslims conquered peoples and regions who had a very rich tradition of intellect. The Persians that got conquered and forced to become Muslims had philosophical traditions that were much older than Islam itself. Zoroastrianism was a very science-minded ideology. Now imagine that in the year 2080, the French will have been forced to convert to Islam, and a few years later, a native French man who is considered to be an apostate by the Muslims there, invents a cold fusion reactor and revolutionizes the world in the area of sustainable energy. After that, an imam puts a fatwa on his head, he gets beaten up in the streets, and then he dies. Now what would you then think about a Muslim activist who then goes to China in the year 2180 to claim that a great Islamic scientist invented the first cold fusion reactor? This wouldn't be a fair depiction of reality at all. However, this is quite similar to what Mehdi Hasan and other activists like him are doing systematically to manipulate Western audiences.
A man named Al-Khwarizmi was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, a Muslim, worked in the golden age of Islam. He's the guy who...
Thanks for having the patience to watch this rather long video. Let's make one final point. One might argue that if you want to study history, you should kind of forget about the present. But a very strong point about Islam and scientific thinking can also be made just by looking at our present world, consisting of 7.7 billion people in 2019. Consider this: if Islam truly had a scientific tradition within it, or if Islam wouldn't be a rigid anti-scientific ideology, then the economic recovery and population growth within Islamic countries would have meant a return of this Islamic scientific thinking. China has had a very bad 19th and 20th century, referred to by the Chinese themselves as the age of humiliation. Today, China is recovering, and together with this we can see the return of Chinese scientists. The same is the case for India. The Indians have a tradition of philosophy. The Hindus got conquered by the Muslims and later colonized by the British. The Muslims are now living in Pakistan and Bangladesh. By far most people living in India are not Muslims. And now that this region is growing economically, we are also seeing the return of Indians engaging in science. This wouldn't have been the case if the Hindus were followers of an anti-scientific ideology. In that case, India would have been much more similar to Pakistan and Bangladesh, where the people are not engaging in science as much at all. Now let's compare China and India to Indonesia, which is a country of 264 million people, and ask yourself, where are all the scientists and thinkers? Why are India and China creating innovation, but Indonesia isn't? Modern day Egypt is a Muslim country of nearly 100 million people. Where is all the innovation? Where are all the scientific centers solving the African water problem? They're not there. Meanwhile, Israel, a country of only 9 million people, is working to solve the African water problem and is contributing to science and human progress more than 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide. A country just a fourth of the size of Jordan. The country Morocco today is not in a bad state because of the warm and dry weather. It is in such a bad state because of Islam. So people like Mehdi Hasan claim that Islam made a contribution to science. I'd say that individuals interested in Greek, Persian and Indian science passed on a very small amount of what was left of the classical civilization to the Europeans. I'd say that if Islam would not have existed, that these classical civilizations would have been able to produce much more scientific advancement. Thanks for watching this video, and I wish you a pleasant day.